Hi everybody, my name's Elizabeth Creighton. I run a very small user experience research consulting business. What is your educational background? I started off with a bachelor's degree, did an honors Bachelor of Science at McMaster. From there, I moved to the University of Chicago and did a PhD in the psychology department in the Integrative Neuroscience program. What is your current position? I run a small consulting business. I've been running this business for about 5 years or so. Before I finished my PhD, I realized that I didn't actually want to stay in academia, and all these thoughts I had about having a lab and being a professor were actually things I did not want to do anymore. Came across user experience research, UX research as a potential career path. And as I kind of looked into it, I was like, oh, this actually sounds like something that might interest me. It kind of seemed sciencey enough that I'd feel like I was still sort of like, I don't know, maintaining my scientist cred in some sort of way. But potentially by leaving academia, I could maybe make more money and not be tied to certain geographical regions. And so my first job was still in Chicago at a small consulting firm that mostly did UX research. The people that worked there were also ex-academics, and they understood that even though I didn't have that practical experience, I did have a lot of transferable skills. So I worked there for a couple of years and sort of learned the ropes of I guess UX research specific stuff. And I also learned things like how to talk to clients and how to present my work to like a business audience versus an academic audience. And after that, I decided I wanted to live in San Francisco. So I got a job at a medium-sized startup called Prosper, which does like peer-to-peer lending, and I was the only researcher there, and that was really, really cool. But then I decided I wanted to move back to Canada, and Shopify had been trying to recruit me for a while, so I ended up after just over a year in San Francisco, leaving that job and moving to Canada, to Toronto, and working for Shopify there. And mostly I worked on the retail team, which is basically anything related to selling in person with Shopify. And so as a UX researcher on that team, I did a lot of work with physical stuff like receipt printers and credit card readers, as well as like the software people use. And after a few years there, I decided to start my own business. And things have been going really well. It's been about 5 years since then, and I've been consistently busy since then. I work with a mix of mostly Canadian and US clients. Kind of, everything from really small startups up to, places like Shopify or big banks or like Wealthsimple or even Facebook. What do you do in your job? I work with clients, basically making sure that they understand who their users are and they're actually taking their users' needs into account when they're creating something for them. The last client I had before I went on maternity leave was a company that makes library websites. And they came to me saying, basically, we know a lot about librarians and other kind of users on the sort of client side, but not a lot about what we call the end user, the regular people who use the libraries and use their library website. They had questions like, what are people using library websites for? What other resources do they use to kind of keep track of what's going on in their library? Even like, what has their actual experience been like using the website made by this company to do things like, put a book on hold or look up the hours for their library or something like that. I work with them to kind of identify which questions are highest priority, figure out what sorts of people we should talk to. So we kind of identified certain target populations we were really interested in learning from. And then I basically take that big mess of data, create usually some sort of presentation or report that I kind of share with the client that walks through all the really interesting stuff we learned. Also another part of that where I take those insights and I actually create, recommendations for how to act on those insights. I do lots of different types of projects, but that's a pretty common type of project. What is your favorite thing about your job? So I think the number one favorite thing for me is that I get to learn a little bit about a lot of different industries. One week I might be talking to oncologists, or like the next week I might be interviewing pilots or The week after that, I might be doing, some usability testing for a product for bank tellers or something like that. I really enjoy the autonomy that I have and the flexibility that I have with my schedule, which is awesome. And I love that I can choose which projects I want to take on. And I really like telling clients things about their product or about their users that they never would have thought of before, and they never would have learned if it weren't for the research. What advice would you give to PhD students in cognitive science with respect to careers? So it's hard moving from academia to outside academia. One thing would be to learn how to turn your CV into a resume. Basically, the point of a CV is to basically make it as long as possible, include every single little thing. A resume should be like 1 page or maybe 2, including the highlights, and not spending a ton of time going into a lot of detail about your PhD research and all your publications and whatnot. Also, learning how to sell your PhD experience as work experience. So don't think about it as like school time. Think of it as work time, right? Like, as a PhD student, you were designing experiments, you were analyzing data, you were creating presentations, you spoke at conferences, maybe having publications or having spoken at conferences or given posters at conferences. Like, that's relatively rare, and people will be like really excited about that. Like, they'll think that's so cool, whereas in academia that's like kind of a very typical thing. I definitely don't think you should list every publication you have on your resume, but being able to say something like, created 5 original studies that were published in high impact journals or something like that. And then I guess finally, learn how to talk about your PhD research in a way that makes it easy for lay people to understand, but also understand the impact, right? Like, you should be able to talk about it in a way that makes it easy for people to understand what you did and also why it was cool and like why was it important. Feel free to embellish a little bit, and if you can kind of relate it to the broader world, then that's really cool. Like, my PhD research was on visual perception. I remember it was good for me to be able to relate the sort of very academic visual perception experiments I did to this idea of, people on websites have limited attention and limited cognitive resources and visual resources. And, my work was related to how people selectively attend to different things or something like that, which, is important for, understanding how people interact with software and other technical stuff in the real world.